Welcome to the Galena-Joe Daviess County Historical Society's presentation of the Spanish flu from 1918 to 1919. Our presenter today is Cory Ritterbusch. He is the owner of Prairie Works Incorporated that has a focus on ecological restoration and sustainable landscapes. He is also the associate planner at the Southwest Wisconsin Regional Planning Commission, is the executive director of Advanced Schulzberg, Inc., and freelances as a photographer, public speaker, writer, and historian. He has given over 75 professional presentations and has written over 50 articles that have been published recently and very shortly in the past. In 2011, he published the book H.S. Papoon, Pioneer Conservationist, and annually publishes research papers for the Society of American Baseball Research. Cory has served or continues to serve on a number of boards, including the Galena Generals, the Joe Daviess County Conservation Foundation, the Northwest Illinois Food Co-op, and the Galena-Joe Daviess County Historical Society.
Well, welcome everybody. From my house to your house, welcome to the Spanish flu in the lead region. My name is Cory and I'll be your presenter for the next hour or so. Friends, it was a year ago today on this Sunday that we were embarking on one of the weirdest weeks that we have all experienced. Children were coming home to be schooled with this thing called virtual learning. Our spouses were all coming home with their work stuff to start working from home. We were getting emails about everything being canceled. And looking back a year later, it was quite the experience. There are no comparables that are perfect, but the one that is closest is the Spanish flu of 1918 and 1919. And that is what we are going to focus on today. So we're going to get into a time machine. And for those of you who have been to my presentations in the past, you've been in this time machine. It's a little old and it's been sitting around a lot lately because I haven't been giving as many presentations, but it should start and run pretty well. And we're going to go back 102 years. And through a series of newspaper clippings, we're going to bring this time machine through the early months of 1918, and we're going to slow it down in the fall of 1918. And you're going to flip through the Thursday papers just like they did back then. We're going to learn about the national news, and we're going to read the names of the friends and neighbors of your community who are perishing and who are sick. And you'll see how this dynamic situation changes. And you're going to see many similarities to this current pandemic in the process. So towards the end of the presentation, the time machine will stop. And we'll have time to reflect on the trip that we were on and discuss. And if there's anybody still left, we'll take some questions and talk about that. So, are we ready? Give me a thumbs up. Okay. So we'll be focusing on how the Spanish flu affected the lead region. Now, the lead region is primarily called the Upper Mississippi lead region, and it's northwest Joe Daviess County, southern Lafayette, southern Grant County. This was where most of the production of lead and zinc was being produced from the 1820s on, with the last lead mine closing at Schulzberg in 1980. So we'll primarily be looking at three towns: Galena, Illinois, Schulzberg, Wisconsin, and Benton, Wisconsin. all these towns are within 15 miles of each other, of course. A little bit of Dubuque, a little bit of Rockford, and a few other scatterings. But this was a worldwide pandemic, and this was something that killed nearly 700,000 people in America. So there are some national storylines that are going to emerge that influenced the lead region as we go on. So we'll take it from here. The font that is used in this opening slide is that of Art Nouveau. That was the design style that was in fashion from 1900 to 1920, but it changed in 1920. Like many things changed. Pandemics often force change, or they foster change that was needed, as we are seeing right now. So Art Nouveau turned into Art Deco in 1920, and that stayed until World War II. But just one example of the many things that changed by the Spanish flu. So in order to understand the pandemic of 1918, you need to understand what life was like in 1918, because it was vastly different. Matter of fact, life in 1991 was vastly different than today. The Spanish flu and coronavirus are very similar in that they are both upper respiratory diseases. They both were transmitted via airborne droplets, but that's about it. That's where the comparisons really end. They're really more different than they are similar, but it is the best comp that we have. In 1918, the American population was 103 million, mostly rural. Today, it is 331 million, mostly urban. That's a 221% increase. So we have a heck of a lot more people today. Life expectancy in 1918 was 48 years old for males. That's 48, folks. So very young. Today, in some states, it is now surpassing 80 in Minnesota, Hawaii, Massachusetts. So we were not expected to live very long anyway in 1918. We also had a much higher level of permanence in our communities. We were not very transient. The Model T car was just in its 8th year of production, and ownership was enjoyed only by the very wealthy. You did not commute to work in 1918 like you do today. You did not live in Galena and commute to Dubuque like is so common. The Wright brothers had put a contraption up in the air that kind of resembles an airplane just 12 years earlier. Air travel was nothing to speak of. Matter of fact, 1918 marked the first year that a piece of mail was put into an airplane. So that was an element of life and transmission that was just not existent. Therefore, the widespread spread was via train travel, which in 1918 was probably as robust as it ever was in the Midwest. The network and infrastructure of rail was peaking at that time. And this is how this thing entered all of our communities. The American healthcare system was just a sliver of what it is today. Each town had about 1 doctor per 500 residents, and they made house calls. They came to you. You did not go somewhere with an appointment. Galena was very dynamic in that regard, as they had a hospital, and that was odd for a smaller town. However, that was ran by the local Catholic Church, the St. Mary's Hospital. And don't laugh, because that legacy still lives on today in Dubuque with both Mercy and Finley Hospital healthcare systems. But the main wild card with Spanish flu in 1918 and its difference with coronavirus is that it hit specifically young people, more specifically young males 20 to 40 years old, the hardest. And can you imagine what that would be like if that was the case with the current pandemic? And death was just more a part of life in America. Accidental death, death at childbirth, death via pandemic, that was all just part of life, thus reflective of the 48-year life expectancy at the time. During research of this, for this presentation, I saw a child who was killed by a hog. I saw drownings in the Mississippi River, people getting hit by trains. A kid was killed by a live wire, early form of electric fencing. Model T crashes, they had no seatbelts. Smallpox, scarlet fever, Russian flu, and many more pandemics had come through the area with regularity in the preceding decades. As many of you know, I'm intimate with the Berry Tavern north of Scales Mound. It is there where 20 people died in the last week of July 1854 due to a cholera outbreak. And in 1918, we still had memory of the Civil War, where 13% of males had died. So here is a picture of what is called a plague house or a fever house. Every community had one of these, and this is when a pandemic would start to break out. People who were ill would be sent to this location, and they could quarantine among others that are sick and be away from the community. These went out of fashion just before the Spanish flu. Many were burned after 1900, and they were a distant memory soon. But it shows how regular pandemics were and how pandemics were more of a part of life, especially what we're used to today. We've had a very nice run without major pandemics for a very long time, and many of us had even thought that it wasn't possible. So, moving towards the Spanish flu. This picture is from 1904. In 1914, 1915, tensions start in Europe, and a world war starts erupting. The US did a good job and avoided that world war until 1917. It was June of 1917 that America entered World War I. And the Spanish flu would not have been the Spanish flu if it wasn't for World War I. So you'll see this as perhaps the biggest theme and greatest part of the Spanish flu is the war. So June of 1917, we enlist our first draft. Our first 378,000 young men get drafted and get sent off to training and to war. And it is March of 1918 that at Fort Riley in Kansas, we have a influenza outbreak that is unexplained. It's a little different than the normal flu, and it's something that nobody has really seen before. But there are also other locations that are candidates as being the beginning of the Spanish flu. But one thing that is agreed is that it got to Europe and it started spreading and mutating there at some time. So here in this graph, we see Spanish flu illnesses and deaths in both America and Europe. And we see there is a obvious rise in the fall, September, October, November, and we're going to get there and focus on that very closely. So in spring, we had what was called kind of a slow burn, where this wasn't moving around too much. It wasn't that transmissible, apparently. It was just hitting the camps that were training camps for World War I soldiers. We look at this, and another thing that you have to recognize is that there's a mathematical phenomenon called the return to mean. And this is when something is going out of average, it eventually will meet its average. So you see it in sports. If a batter is hitting very well for a month of, say, July, he hits 410, we know by the end of the season, he's not going to keep that up. And by the end of the season, he's going to be back to his normal average. Well, we use this term in investing. If a stock or bond is overperforming, we know it's going to return to mean, and there's a sell-off. Some of you might exercise a lot in January and maybe February, but in June you have returned to mean and you are exercising about as much as you normally do anyway. So you get the point. And we know that pandemics do this. Pandemics come in waves. So most of the summer of 1918 was very normal in this area. There were the county fairs, baseball games, weddings. The Red Cross had a big picnic. Illinois was celebrating its centennial, and there were a lot of events around that. So everything was normal for the most part during the summer of 1918. And here we see the first cadets from the draft being sent for training to Camp Grant in Rockford. Every Thursday, the Galena Gazette was showing the pictures and reporting the names of these young men on a weekly basis. And here's the first crew to leave on June 28th. Now on July 10th, we see something emerge. This is buried deep into page 5 of the July 10th, 1918 Galena Gazette. And it's talking about the German army is coming under a influenza outbreak. And now we know that at some point at this time, this flu mutated and it became deadlier and more virulent. And it also became more deadly towards young men. And this mutation was happening right now in July. So we move into August, and again, we're seeing more pictures of those young cadets going off to Camp Grant. And I'm reminded of the old Barry McGuire song, Eve of Destruction. Maybe some of you younger guys out there know the Guns N' Roses version, Appetite for Disaster. That's what was happening each week as they're sending these young boys to Camp Grant. Also on August 8th, Colonel Charles Hagedorn is put in charge of Camp Grant at Rockford. Hagedorn was a lifelong military man. He was the perfect man for this job. He was prim and proper, well experienced, a perfectionist. He did not accept failure. He was everything you expect to be able to drill habits into young men. And he had 43,000 of them under his command at Camp Grant at this time. Camp Grant was huge. It was at the confluence of the Kishwaukee and Rock Rivers south of Rockford. Today, this is the site of Rockford Airport. Many of you may enjoy the nonstop flights to Orlando and Las Vegas from this airport. And I guarantee you will not look at this airport ever again the same. This was a huge complex. There was another complex that was similar in size, not as large, at Great Lakes Naval Station. This is north of Chicago. I believe its address is Highland Park. And it is these two camps where all World War I cadets were going. They're getting trained there, they're being sent to Boston from there. And the early cadets that had put in their 1 year of service were coming back, and they were coming to these camps before they are being let go and going home. And it is through these two locations that the Spanish flu was allowed to spread. And you're also seeing the limits of my graphic artist abilities. So just 10 days after Hagedorn was given 43,000 troops to be in charge of, they upped the amount to 57,000 troops. And that's just an incredible amount of people, folks. That is the size of Dubuque metro area. It's the size of many small cities. And it's almost hard to fathom the amount of people. And for those of you that think politics and healthcare is a new dynamic, I have included the slide on the right side. So as I mentioned, all these troops are going to Fort Devon in Boston. And Commonwealth Pier in Boston is where ships are coming and going with the troops to Europe, whether they're landing in England or France. They're all going out of Boston. And Fort Devon was a very busy place. It was kind of the Ellis Island, if you will, for troops. They're coming and going out of there. This is where you check in and check out. So Boston becomes a very dynamic location for the Spanish flu. You have Fort Devon and you have all the troops there of young men. You also have many colleges located in Boston. Harvard, Cambridge, Boston College, just to name a few, are located in Boston. And unbeknownst to many, the Spanish flu began circulating in Boston at this time. It is on September 1st that Camp Devon reports its first case of this Spanish flu. Now, fast forward a few days to Thursday, September 5th, the World Series begins in Boston. So now we have an influx of media and people there for the largest sporting event in the nation. The World Series was huge at this time. Fort Devon, might I add, housed 45,000 men at this point. On Tuesday, September 10th, the Galena Gazette reported that now 100 sailors have the flu. The next day, on September 11th, the Boston Red Sox defeat the Chicago Cubs 4-2 in the World Series. This is the only World Series to ever be competed for in the month of September. And they did that because of an incoming draft that was going to affect September 12th. And on the bottom of the front page, you see that draft. This draft was for all males up to 45 years old. And this was the third of 3 drafts that occurred. So this was taking a big chunk of people. All American males up to 45 years old was a big part of the population. This would include me, to put it into perspective. And I'm not sure why I would be in a world war, but all men up to 45 were going. So the next day, things have escalated at Fort Devens, and 14,000 were now reported ill. So it had gone from 1 to 14,000 ill in 13 days at that camp. The next Tuesday, on September 17th, the first man reported ill who came from Camp Devon at Great Lakes Naval Station is reported ill. So the next Thursday weekly paper, we see the names and the faces of all those cadets going to Camp Grant. The following Saturday, Camp Grant gets its first case. Again, people from Fort Devon who have arrived. By midnight on the 21st, 108 more would be reporting ill. The next day, the 22nd, 194 would report ill at Camp Grant. 1,500 at Camp Devens in a single day. The following Monday, there were now 371 reporting ill at Camp Grant, 4,600 at Great Lakes Naval Station. Now, by this time, it was not being contained to just the Army bases. On Tuesday, the next day, the first person reporting ill in the city of Dubuque occurs. Now, Colonel Hagedorn at Camp Grant was trying to think how he could get this under control, albeit he was struggling. But he had an idea that if he could reduce the amount of people and allow people to spread out a little bit more, he could get this thing under control. So he had already put everybody outside the barracks and into outdoor tents. But now he just put 3,100 cadets onto a train for Georgia. So he was going to subtract 3,100 from that population and start doing that style. So also on that Tuesday, the 24th, Camp Grant had its first fatality on the day the train left. On Thursday, the 26th, Galena Gazette reports that women are needed as hospital assistants. And this is another dynamic situation about the Spanish flu, is that we were short on healthcare because all the young nurses and doctors were being used for the war effort. And there was a big demand for that. And I saw this article come up in all the local papers in some fashion. Also on this day, the Gazette reported that the state of Illinois is preparing to impose restrictions to stop the spread of the flu. The very next day, Great Lakes Naval Station is now reporting 8,700 people ill. And one of those people who was ill was that of Lyle Eggleston, and he is the first victim of the Spanish flu in Galena and the region. Although he was not living in Galena at the time, he was at Great Lakes Naval Station. The news was shocking. Lyle Eggleston was a popular guy in town. He was the president of his senior class at Galena High School, a 1916 graduate of Galena High School. And things started getting real at this point. So a few things going on this Saturday, the 28th. 200,000 people made it out to the Liberty Loans Parade in Philadelphia. And this was against local health officials' suggestion. They were saying, do not hold this. But they did anyway. And this really became what we know as a super spreader event. So that 200,000 there turned out not to be the best decision. Also on this day, U.S. Congress allocated $1 million for Spanish flu research, which at the time was a large sum of money. The next day, on Sunday, the 29th, 635 reported ill at Camp Grant. The next day, 16 died at Camp Grant, and it is now being reported in Rockford that it is infecting the civilian population. So that brings us to the end of September. This is a month in which 12,000 Americans died of the Spanish flu. This is where we need to put one of those parental guidance issues out, because October is going to get nasty. So get ready to cover their ears, folks. So October 1st, there are 4,100 now in the hospital at Camp Grant ill. 28 died on October 1st there. The following day, 40 dead at Camp Grant. And you remember that train that Colonel Hagedorn had sent to Georgia? Well, things weren't going well. As the train was going down to Georgia, everybody was getting sick. And they were getting off at stops where they were reloading supplies, they were refueling, and people were going AWOL, including the conductors. They were just trying to get away from each other. So that wasn't going well. The next day, on October 3rd, the Galena Gazette on page 3, mind you, had an article saying that influenza will attack millions. It's a little late at this point. It was in circulation and had pretty much entered every community by this point, whether they knew it or not. The following day, more than 100 died at Camp Grant. That was the first day that that number was in the triple digits. And ambulances, motorized ambulances, were replaced by mules at Camp Grant to carry the bodies. And it was reported that the mules were sitting down and had stopped working. Then the following day, on Saturday, October 5th, the Associated Press picked up a piece out of the Telegraph-Herald talking about the flu raging in the Wisconsin village of Benton. Now, Benton is a mining community 12 miles north of Galena, and it was hitting there hard, and it had continued. So from the Benton Advocate itself, it had closed at that time. Everything was shut down, and they were shunning the common drinking cup. I highlight that because we're going to talk about that later. So the train that Hagedorn sent down made it to Georgia, and a telegram was sent to Camp Grant explaining what happened. Hagedorn was not used to failure, and he could not take the news. So he ended his life. And things would not get better there. With its leadership now dead, things wouldn't improve anywhere. And really, if Hagedorn was aware that no one could get this under control, he may not have taken such a drastic measure. But it was not communicated with him about what was happening throughout the country at all the bases. He thought the situation was specific to him, and he had a very hard time with it. So, and also note the headline below that the governor of Minnesota had now closed all Minnesota schools. Closure will now become the theme in the news. The following day, Telegraph Herald reports that Iowa is shutting down for 30 days. Then the following day, on October 10th, the Galena Gazette reports the scene at Camp Grant and its goriness. At this time, also Shullsburg paper, Benton paper, all reporting many miners are sick. The Shullsburg Pick and Gad, the editor, is saying that he was struggling to get the newspaper out due to sickness among his staff at the newspaper. Following day, the Wisconsin State Journal is reporting that 1,000 flu cases in Madison and that the city of Madison will be closing. Dubuque closed on October 11th. Virtually at this time, this is where we are 1 year ago from now, where closure became the dominant theme. This is the theme everywhere at this point. The Benton Advocate captures the local news so well in its statement on October 11th, saying how 1/2 of the inhabitants of Benton, which was roughly 1,000 people, so that meant 500 cases. At that time, it had it in the last 10 days, and no family was unaffected. Shullsburg Pick and Gad is reporting the dance Friday night was postponed, and also reporting that it has not gone through as much as it has with other towns. So likely in a attempt to compare it to Benton. And there he is reporting about the sickness at his the staff at the Pick and Gad paper, and there is some general improvement. He's being positive with this report, and we see that even in this current pandemic, we tend to be more positive and not accepting the reality. That Saturday, most of college football was shut down at this point, but there still were some competitions occurring, as we see in this great picture between Georgia Tech and Furman. This occurred on the outskirts of Atlanta, and in my research, I showed that Atlanta was not really hit very hard by the Spanish flu, and that might have been one of the cases why this game was allowed to continue. So moving on to the next week, this is a snapshot of the Benton Advocate paper, and it's death everywhere. Personals are talking about its sickness, and they don't have time to put the obituaries together. And this is normal. I'm using this because the clarity of the image is the best, and hopefully you folks can read it. But all of our communities are being hit very hard this time. We're also seeing for the first time that the papers are publishing advice on how to protect yourself, what to do when you do become sick, and getting guidance from the federal government. This is from Hazel Green, talking about its closures. But here's from the Shullsburg Pick and Gad, from the Medical Service Corps, the Council of the National Defense out of Washington, D.C., talking about thorough cleanliness of houses, clothing, utensils, and avoiding stirring up dust, gargling with spray, the nose and throat with antiseptic fluids, and things of that nature. So we had finally gone into a proactive state where we're trying to get information out to the public about this. However, 2, 3, 4 weeks late. So it is on this day, October 17th, 1918, that John Giles of Shullsburg dies. And here the Pick and Gad gives a very detailed account of the death of John Giles. 18-year-old son of Mr. and Mrs. John Giles of this city died very suddenly at his home Thursday evening. The young man had not felt well for a few days and decided to stay in the house. Toward the evening, he was sleeping on the lounge when his mother, thinking he would be more comfortable in bed, awoke him and told him he'd better go upstairs. He got up and started to get a cup of water. He staggered and dropped dead. I show this slide for 2 reasons. A, this shows how fast Spanish flu could kill you. There are many reports of people who felt fine in the morning and were dead by the end of the day. And here we have John Giles, who was just at work at the Copeland mine the day before and decided to stay home from work that day, but did not make it. But John Giles died in the room that I am sitting in. I live in the Giles house. I know the history of the Giles family very well. Matter of fact, I got mail for John Giles' brother last month. I'd always known that John Giles died at 18. I assumed accident, but it wasn't until I did this research that I learned that he died of the Spanish flu. So here, history can come and become full circle and be living. So from our living room to ours. So more advice from the newspapers. This is from October 18th. It's talking about symptoms, incubation periods, infectiousness. At this time, they were saying that you had about a 1-day period where you were infectious without symptoms. So we know with coronavirus, that can be much longer, and you may not have symptoms at all, which makes this current pandemic different. But we're finally getting this sort of information out on October 18th. So going into the next week, James Doyle dies on the 23rd in Shullsburg. He was a friend of John Giles, another young popular man. And the Shullsburg paper reporting that many, many were sick at the Copeland mine. This was the employment location of John Giles. So here we see a Shullsburg Pick and Gad piece talking about when we can expect this pandemic to be over, and it's talking about how previous pandemics have been taken a long time and were slow to resolve. There was a ban that was lifted in some fashion about what you could do, and that here they're saying that even though that ban has been lifted, we still need to be very, very careful. So moving on to the next week, This is just scattering about what is happening in Galena. And as we see, it is all death and sickness. For my Galena territory folks, I highlighted the news from Guilford Township. In this case, in that locality, there were some laid up with the flu, but were recovering so far. There were a few that died in Guilford Township, I know, but most of all, the rural townships fared better than the cities, as you could imagine. So on October 31st, the Shullsburg Pick and Gad reports serums could be used to help inoculate those who are sick. And we saw this very early on in the coronavirus. We thought that if we drew blood from those infected, and we could use that blood to create medicines to help those infected. And again, this is coming up at this time, but they did not end up using that. That was something that they were just trying. And we're also seeing the mining news. They said 100 miners were discharged from the mines, and they should be back at full production in 30 days. Now, I think we had two things going on. We had a pandemic where we were supposed to be distancing ourselves, but we also needed to keep producing in our factories and our mines because we had a war underway and they were tied to each other. And even though this pandemic was killing these miners, they were forced to continue to work. I just can't imagine what that would have been like. But they were hoping that in 30 days that they would be back at 100% production. And that brings us to the end of October. This was a month that 200,000 Americans died of the Spanish flu. This remains as the deadliest month in American history still today. So we move into November and things would improve. It peaked in October, but things, there's death and sickness still occurring, but you're going to see some change in the reporting. And kicking that off on November 2nd, the Benton Advocate is talking about meat producers and how they did their full duty. There was this supply chain issue in our food system. If that sounds familiar, this was happening in both these pandemics. Also on the right side, please note that they had recognized that the Spanish flu was now deadlier than the World War that they were in. Galena Gazette reporting on the 6th about the shortage of food again. Also on the 6th, Galena is reporting that they are going to turn the YMCA into a hospital. The YMCA at that time was located on Main Street in Galena, just past the DeSoto House on the east side of the street. So that is being converted to help with the sick at the time, a makeshift hospital. On November 7th, the Associated Press is reporting that 21,000 young children were orphaned due to the Spanish flu. Just an incredible amount of people. And this shows how massive in scale that death was in October of 1918. But we would receive our outro. On Monday, November 11th, the World War I ended. This was good news. And that right angle to this whole problem would end because production and the need for production would be eliminated. And this goes into factories around America. And in this area, it would meant our mines would not have to produce as much. So we had our outro at this point. This was the very beginning of the tipping point, getting back out of this pandemic. In typical fashion of coronavirus, the following Tuesday, the next day, Wisconsin had a big election in which large numbers of people came out to vote. On the 13th, that Wednesday, Galena is reporting a postal worker shortage. They were short on men to deliver the mail at that time. I love this one. The influenza germ is virulent. So a month, 6 weeks after it started, they're reminding us how important it is to stay focused on the suggestions to put an end to this. Now we get into the conspiracy theory portions of the news. On November 14th, some are calling this epidemic the return of the Black Plague, which was a Middle Ages pandemic. So sometimes in times of crisis, we look towards alternate realities to make sense or justify desires, and that's what was beginning to happen. So Spanish influenza, do not fear when fighting a German or a germ. We're getting into now also some quackery. We were seeing ads, and I have some more in the future here. People trying to take advantage of the situation, and they're advertising quackery, medicinal medicines to cure the Spanish flu. Here we're seeing on November 28th, this is Thanksgiving, 1918, the return of school in Shullsburg. And here they're laying out their guidelines. So if you are sick, you're not allowed to come to school. And if you do come down with the Spanish flu as a student, you cannot return for 2 more weeks. And they are all guidelines that are very similar to what we saw in this past year at our schools. And the day after Thanksgiving, a Friday, James Vipond was reported to go to Freeport. And it also reported that he came down with the Spanish flu. Now, how embarrassing that the editor to the Shullsburg paper include this in his paper, because James Vipond was obviously not following social distancing protocols as recommended, and now he's come down with the flu. So very embarrassing for Mr. Vipond to have that reported. And it's too bad. James Vipond was a good guy. This is he and his wife in 1919. That's exactly how they looked that year. They were good people. Early merchant in Galena, retired to farming. He owned the Berry Tavern from 1883 onward. He retired to Shullsburg in 1914 and built a nice house on Judgment Street to retire in. That is, the house is where my children receive some of their child care. But good guy, he made the wrong decision. So now we're getting into December. December 5th, 1918, 2 girls in the Timmons family, twin 5-year-olds die. And I bring this up not only to show you the type of sadness that came upon many families during this. But many of you may recall the Timmons name from my local baseball history presentation 2 years ago on Francis Timmons. Francis Timmons was a 1939 graduate of Benton High School, and he was an exceptional athlete and baseball player. And he may have been able to make it to the major leagues. And he was on that track, but he was drafted into World War II and died in France in that war effort. And I came across this, and I just thought, you know, just so horrible for somebody in this generation, for parents to have 2 5-year-old twins die and then have another son taken by World War II. And that was just how life was back then. And sometimes I wonder why we complain so much today. The very next day, Shullsburg lost the town doctor. And here the Pick and Gad says that the death came from a brain hemorrhage brought on by overwork during the recent influenza epidemic. Dr. Hayden was a great guy. He was once the head of the Wisconsin Medical Association, and I had the opportunity to do research on the house he built and got intimate with his life. But a great guy, but just one example of how all of the town doctors were being overworked because of this Spanish flu. But it was really the only case of one dying, I should add. So here we have more of the conspiracy theory, and here we're seeing an attempt to make the citizens feel comfortable to go downtown and shop, in this case in Galena. So this is from the November 6th Galena Gazette. I should add, on December 10th, there was a report of Cuba City of a 6-year-old dying. And here's some of that quackery that I spoke of earlier, these alternate medical opportunities to cure yourself from Spanish flu. December 19th, Galena Gazette, reporting about how 5 doctors met in Chicago and had a meeting and decided that masks weren't worth it. They weren't working. So this was reported on page 2 of that Gazette. Here in that same Gazette, Spanish influenza is disease of mystery, and it's talking about how it can affect some people to a great degree, results in sickness and death, and others are not as infected, and they couldn't figure out why young people were infected and not the older generation. Very odd, and we see that today, of course. So Spanish flu, coronavirus, both diseases of mystery. And here we're seeing here on December 19th that the Associated Press is reporting that Camp Grant had the most influenza deaths of any Army base in America. Now, the day after Christmas, which was a fairly normal Christmas, to be honest, lots of reports of church services, families were getting together according to the personals. It was actually fairly normal, in my opinion. And this is further solidified by a victory ball on New Year's Eve being planned at Turner Hall in Galena. And this would become the norm. activities were normalizing. Life was getting back to normal by this point. So getting to the end of December and into January, and looking at the papers from January, February, March, April, I even went as far as June to see what was happening. And it was obvious that this had faded away. There were some pneumonia deaths in those months, but most part of the news about Spanish flu had faded away. It had actually moved westward towards the mountain states, and then finally to the West Coast in January. There was a small third wave in America in the spring, and that was subsidized by summertime. And the last Spanish flu death was reported finally in 1920. So we got to park this time machine here. Hold on. Let me get that. All right. Sometimes it doesn't get in the park, and it's been sitting around a lot lately, as I talked about. But now we can talk about the aftermath and what happened. It was enormous. The Spanish flu's effect on our country was massive. Life expectancy dropped by 12 years at the end of the Spanish flu. So for a male, it was at 48. It was now 36. And it was just a residual of so many of the young people dying, the young soldiers, the young miners, the factory workers. There was news stories about funeral homes hiring armed guards to stop people from stealing coffins. The population, which had been increasing by 1.5 million people per year on a regular basis, coming up to 1918, dropped by 60,000. Okay, this is the most drastic drop that's ever occurred. And actually, I believe it was the last time a population had dropped at all in the last 100 years. So that's fairly amazing. Half of the deaths of the Spanish flu were between 20 and 40-year-olds. And we began that war with 378,000 soldiers, and we ended it with 4.7 million soldiers. And this should give you an idea of how widespread the effort was to win the war, and also how intense the travel on the train system was. We were moving 4.7 million troops around by train and moving this virus with it at the time, and thus began this spread. So, like I said earlier, this would not have been a worldwide pandemic if not for World War I. Some graphs and charts to show you. This shows September, October, November in the US. Again, we're seeing that peak in most cities in October. Some cities handled this better than others. Philadelphia was notorious for not handling it well. Every book I read focused on that. Milwaukee was a shining light for control of this influenza. Very Germanic town, future Union town. They were given protocols to stand by, and they did it. St. Louis was also did a good job. Chicago was always in the middle of the pack from my research. This again showing where our city stood. Nashville always stood out as a town that didn't do well. Here we're seeing St. Louis towards the bottom of this list. Now I want to focus on this one for a little bit. This is zinc production from the lead region. So Joe Davies, Lafayette, Grant counties throughout the mining history up until the mid 50s. Zinc was a major part of the process of producing metals. If you heard the term galvanized steel, that requires zinc to be made with. So a big part of anything metal being used, and World War I was requiring a lot of that. And we see this obvious spike at World War I in the production of zinc. Benton was a big zinc producing community. Cuba City was also a zinc producing community. Shullsburg a little bit, but more on the lead side. And Galena was more of a hybrid as well. But we see how it outpaced even World War II production by a lion's share. And this really went hand in hand with how we handled the pandemic here in this area. So here is our graph of the Spanish flu. This shows how the return to mean occurred following the October uprise, and then the small third wave that came in spring of 1919. And then we see the current coronavirus curve. We had our third wave in this recent fall, and it has returned to mean, and hopefully we will see this thing continue to drop as it has in the last month and 2 months. So in final, there's a few things to say, but one thing that I read that made sense the most for me, and it was from Dr. Alfred Crosby, who wrote a book, 1918, Epidemic and Peace, America's Forgotten Pandemic. And he said, there were two enormously important things going on at one time in 1918, and they were at right angles to each other. One was the influenza pandemic, which dictated that everything should speed up, and the other was saying that everything should shut down. But the country could only contain one big idea, and that big idea was to win the war. And that's essentially why this was so brutal and so nasty at the time. So, in my opinion, this, without a doubt, the hardest hit community in our region, and I've looked at them all, was Benton. Benton was just ravaged. And I have one great story that I'd like to tell. A friend of mine was telling me a story of his grandmother who lived in Benton. She was at her home with her sister, and it was cold out, but the windows to their house were open. And that was likely because they were well aware of what fresh air could do. But their cousin came over, and they saw her walk up to the house, came up to the open window and said, "Your cousin Johnny died," and walked away. And I just love those real life stories that are still with us here today, kind of folklore. Here's a comparison of where we stand locally with coronavirus and with COVID-19. We're not going to verbally talk to them. You can see them. By the time this is getting done, we'll be getting close to the same number of fatalities in our respected states and counties. But you have to keep in mind that the population of America was much less than it is today. Albeit our region is fairly similar right now. We have not had a population increase over the last 100 years here, like our country has seen. But you can look at this data and take from it from how you seem fit, but this is where the numbers stand on both of these. Unfortunately, I was not able to find a number for fatalities for Joe Daviess County. And I encourage some young person, because that would make a great topic for a research paper if they are majoring in history or something. It would be really fun to do. So that's where we stand with that. I had felt a little bad about some of these pandemic victims, and really the whole pandemic in general. As we know, this was not heavily publicized. We didn't learn about the Spanish flu when we were growing up, and there's many reasons why. But I had to go and help my buddy out, Dr. Hayden, and I cleaned his grave last year. Oh, I should say my family cleaned his grave. But it was kind of the least we could do for all these great heroes that emerged. And so anyway, Dr. Hayden, thanks for all your work, and everybody else. And for all you Mazzucchelli heads out there, Dr. Hayden's wife, Emma McNulty, her parents were married by Samuel Father Mazzucchelli. Another one was Dr. Mary Gratchett from Shullsburg, another Shullsburg physician. She was a big promoter of the women's suffrage movement. She went to New York City in 1914 to fight for the right to vote. And it was reported later in her life that she was a hero, as during the Spanish flu outbreak, she went to New Diggins and was helping all the infected miners. But she survived the Spanish flu, and she had an amazing medical career as one of the first female doctors in the Midwest, and lived until the ripe age of 93 years old. There are many people still living in our communities who were brought into the world by Dr. Mary Gratchett. And Dr. Mary, we thank you for all of your help during that period. Some of the references that I used for this research and presentation are included. Big thanks to Sarah Millhouse, Brandon Belke, and Carter Newton, who did a great amount of research in 2018 with the Galena Gazette. Thanks to you folks. And we'll have time for some questions.
Cory, before you start with the questions, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, we did have one question. Nico's Nana has asked, what were the symptoms of the Spanish flu?
Well, very similar to coronavirus. It was fever, labored breathing. But really, what happened was your lungs filled up with fluids, and that thus started affecting everything else in your body, and oftentimes led to pneumonia. And so you'd read in the paper that many people died of pneumonia, and that was just an after effect of Spanish flu. But it affected many people differently, but flu, labored breathing, fever, they were all hand in hand. Very tired. So very similar in that regard. This thing of a really, really bad flu.
And why was it called the Spanish flu?
Well, that goes back to Europe. As we know, it kind of got to Europe and spread out. And Spain was a country that did not have regulations for its press. And they were the first to report what was happening, that many people were being infected by this influenza type disease. And since they were the first to report it and report it accurately and reliably, it got the name Spanish flu from that, which is really too bad, because it really had nothing to do with Spain or being Spanish. So.
Okay. Okay, I'm gonna take the screen away a little bit and see if we can get some questions. Or you may have to turn it back over to me. Okay, there we go. Does anyone else have any questions? We have lots of thank yous, Cory, in the comments.
I have a question for Cory. This is Nancy Winter. Sorry, I'm not on the.
Hello,
page.
Nancy.
Hi, Cory.
Hi.
Well, nice to see you.
Yes.
You mentioned the Great Lakes Naval Station and Camp Grant. There must have been other camps throughout the United States where the soldiers were collecting before they went off to Europe. Where were some of those other centers?
Boy, you know, I can't remember them all, but I can tell you there was one on the outskirts of Detroit that was also in the lead for cases and deaths. But that skips my mind right now. But really, every major city had one, and they were usually on the outskirts, just like Fort Devens was in Avery, Massachusetts, outside of Boston. And Camp Grant was on the outskirts of Rockford. It was very common. Springfield, Illinois had one. I know there's one in Indianapolis. I wish I could answer that better, but yeah, they were scattered amongst everywhere, usually around major cities.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. And I see Janet Eggleston, your face appearing, who is a descendant of Lyle Eggleston, our first, Galena's first victim. And Janet, I'm sure you have some things to say about Lyle.
Well, he was my uncle. He was my father's oldest brother. And I must say he was very determined to serve in World War I. He joined the Army first and was stationed in Texas, I believe, got very ill. I'm not sure what with at that point, was discharged for health reasons, came home, recovered, joined the Navy, and was at Great Lakes when he got the influenza. So, like so many, he was so young. He was just 21.
Yes. Yeah, and he had, I believe he had experience at the Art Institute in Chicago, and aspiring artist as well. But yeah, just such a common story for many people.
Cory, Carol Ann asked, in the Victory Ball article, you referenced it was at Turner Hall, but it was referenced as a gym.
Well, I think at that time, Turner Hall was kind of a gym because the Turner Association was that of gymnastics. So, yeah, it essentially was a gym at the time. Mm-hmm.
Are there any other questions?
I'll take another one, Cory.
Everybody.
It's Nancy.
Yes. Okay.
I'm wondering how the death toll in the United States in those years compared to Europe. Must have been terrible there.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, Europe was ravaged as well, especially with less of a rural nature than we have here. Yeah, it peaked earlier there, and took longer to get rid of. But yeah, Europe was just ravaged without a doubt. And I see another one.
Called the Spanish flu?
Yes.
Was it called Spanish flu there?
Yes. Yeah. And there have been attempts, folks. The to start calling this the Great Influenza and trying to change its name in all fairness to Spain and Spaniards, but it's the Spanish flu is sticking, unfortunately.
Where did the flu start?
Well, there's three options. One was China, which seems to be a fall guy, and then Fort Riley in Kansas, and then in Europe somewhere. John Barry, who wrote the book, The Great Influenza, he believes it happened at, and I'll kill two birds with one stone here, that it started within the swine population among pigs, somewhere in Kansas near Fort Riley, that February, March of 1918. And there's plenty of information on the internet that supports that theory. So if John Barry believes it, that's what I believe.
We have a question from Lizzie. Hold on, Lizzie Ferry. What kinds of sources other than the local newspapers did you find and use in your research?
It was 90% newspapers, because that's easy. I own all of the Shullsburg papers. They're in my office. I can research them at my pleasure. Then I make appointments at the Galena history room, and then the Benton papers are available through a subscription service that I have and own. And that's how I got Dubuque and Madison papers. Freeport papers, I get through that method. So newspapers.com, you pay $12 a month, you get access to a time machine. It's really wonderful. But the John Barry book and the Skip Durgin book that I read were extremely valuable. And I noted that in 2018, Carter Newton for the Galena Gazette was writing a 100th anniversary piece on the Spanish flu for a supplement that went into the Galena Gazette, and it was wonderful. And if you really, anybody wants a turnkey information source about it in Galena, that is it, and it's available on their homepage on their website right now. Thanks, Liz.
Okay, we have no other questions. We'd like to thank you, Cory, and also we would like to invite you all to our next program in April, on April 11th, for Tracy Roberts and the Pulpit and the Pickaxe. If we'd also like to encourage you to help support these programs so we can bring you more of these. You can support by donation at galenahistory.org under the donate button. We would really appreciate your support. Thank you so much for the wonderful presentation, Cory. We appreciate it. And we invite you all back in again in April. You can find out the information on the April program on our website, galenahistory.org. Thank you.